My own brother stood over my little girl on her birthday, screaming at her so loudly she froze with fear, and that was the exact moment I realized I had been protecting the wrong person my entire life. Stick with me while I share my story, and if it touches you, don't forget to support our channel by hitting that subscribe button, dropping a like, and sharing it with the people you care about. My name is Lena, and my daughter Mary turned 7 that day. I invited my family for a small birthday gathering at home. I knew my brother Cade could be difficult, but I still hoped he would behave. He arrived late, already annoyed, complaining about everything. When Mary walked past him and accidentally spilled a little soda on his shirt, Cade exploded. He stood over her and screamed so loud she covered her ears and began to cry. I stepped in front of her, shaking with anger. What hurt most was that the rest of my family said nothing. They just watched, afraid to upset him. Cade stormed out, blaming Mary. She looked at me with tears in her eyes and asked if she did something wrong. That moment broke me. I realized I had let Cade get away with too much for too long. I started gathering every message, every loan, and every promise he never kept. I spoke to a lawyer friend who told me I had every right to demand repayment. I invited the family to dinner the next week. When I laid out the proof, Cade had no way to talk his way out. For once, everyone saw the truth. My family stopped covering for him. Mary began to smile again. Our home felt calmer. Weeks later, Cade called, asking to return to normal. I told him normal ended the moment he scared my child. He would have to earn his place back. That became the lesson he never forgot. The morning of my daughter's celebration started quietly. I woke up early, wanting the day to feel warm and steady for Mary, who had been counting down for weeks. She was excited the moment she opened her eyes, already asking if the balloons were ready and if our relatives would come on time. I tried to keep everything calm so she could enjoy her day without stress. As a mother raising her on my own, I always tried to make her feel surrounded by people who cared about her. I kept the decorations small, set out a few snacks, and made sure her favorite cake was waiting in the kitchen. I wasn't aiming for anything big, just a peaceful gathering where she could feel loved. Inviting my relatives felt natural, even though it meant dealing with my brother Cade. He had a way of shifting the energy in any room. Some days he was pleasant, other days he carried a storm with him. Still, I kept giving him space in our lives, hoping he could act right for his niece. I wanted Mary to grow up knowing her family, even the complicated parts of it. As I looked around the house, checking the table and setting out plates, a small worry grew in my chest. I pushed it down. I kept telling myself that today would be different, that Cade would show up with a calm attitude, that he would at least try for Mary's sake. Mary ran around the living room, humming and holding the little paper crown she planned to wear. Seeing her joy made me hope even harder that nothing would ruin it. I didn't know then that my decision to include Cade would shape the entire day in a way I never expected. The moment my brother stepped into the house, I felt the air change. He came in much later than everyone else, moving with that impatient walk he always had when something had already annoyed him before he arrived. His face was tight, his jaw set, and he barely greeted anyone. Instead, he scanned the room like everything around him bothered him. Before I could even say hello, he started pointing out things he didn't like. He made a comment about where he had to park, acting as if walking a few extra steps was some kind of personal insult. Then he muttered about the voices inside the house, saying it was too much. After that, he glanced at the party setup and made another dig, this time about how things looked. Nothing was right in his eyes, not even the smallest detail. I tried to stay calm. I had spent the entire morning trying to keep the day positive for my daughter, and I wasn't going to let his mood destroy that. So I nodded, breathed slowly, and told myself not to react. I kept hoping he would settle down after a few minutes. He had done this before, come in grumpy and then eventually shift once he got comfortable. I prayed that today would be the same. But as I watched him move around the room, I saw something in the way he looked at people, especially the kids. It was a sharp, restless kind of stare, like he was waiting for the smallest excuse to snap. His gaze kept dropping to whoever was closest to him, and each time, my stomach tightened a little more. I could feel a warning inside me, a quiet voice telling me that he hadn't come in a state to let things go. Something in him was building, and I could sense it long before it showed. When it was almost time to bring out the cake, everyone gathered in the living room. The kids were laughing, moving around with excitement, and Mary was holding a small cup of soda, trying to balance it while dancing in her little paper crown. I was in the kitchen lighting the candles when I heard a sudden shuffle behind me. I turned just in time to see Mary accidentally brush past my brother. It was the softest bump, nothing rough, nothing done on purpose. A tiny bit of her drink splashed onto his shirt, barely more than a dot. But the look that flashed across his face made my heart drop. His expression shifted in an instant. His jaw tightened, his cheeks heated, and he stepped forward, towering over my child. Before I could even reach them, he unleashed his voice at her. It wasn't a normal scold. It was a full blast of anger, sharp and loud, aimed straight at a 7-year-old who hadn't meant any harm. The entire room froze. Every bit of joy, every bit of birthday energy, disappeared in seconds. Mary's eyes widened, and her little body stiffened as if she didn't know whether to run or stay still. Then the tears came, rolling down her cheeks while her hands shook around the empty cup. But he didn't stop. He kept raising his voice, throwing harsh words at her, talking like she had done something unforgivable. He acted as if this tiny accident was a personal attack, as if she had ruined his day on purpose. I rushed across the room, stepping between them, pulling my daughter into my arms. Her small frame trembled against my chest. All I could think, as I held her close, was how quickly one moment had turned a happy celebration into something painful and unforgettable. The sound of his outburst still echoed in the room when I realized something else, something that pierced me even harder. I looked around at the faces of the people I had trusted all my life. Not one of them stepped toward us. Not a single voice rose to stop him or defend a child who had done nothing wrong. Everyone stood stiff, almost glued to their spots. Some looked at the floor, others stared at the walls, pretending they hadn't just witnessed a grown man yelling at a little girl. Their bodies went rigid with fear or discomfort, but not courage. No one moved between him and my trembling daughter. No one even whispered that he had gone too far. For a moment, it felt like the whole world had shrunk to a quiet, heavy bubble around us. My mother avoided my eyes. My father folded his arms and looked elsewhere. My aunt fiddled with her phone even though it wasn't ringing. It was as if protecting him mattered more than speaking up for a scared child. I wrapped my arms around Mary, holding her close against my chest. She clung to me, breathing fast, her face pressed into my shoulder. I could feel her heartbeat hammering through my shirt. I whispered that she was safe, even though my own stomach twisted with disappointment and disbelief. As I looked at the people I had always tried to keep close, something inside me shifted. These were the same people I invited into my home, the ones I kept trying to keep connected for my daughter's sake. And in the moment she needed them most, they turned into statues. Standing there with Mary in my arms, I understood something I had avoided for years. We had been standing alone for a long time, I had just never wanted to see it. Cade pulled himself back only when he ran out of breath, not when he realized what he had done. He didn't show a hint of regret. He didn't look at the little girl he had just terrified. He didn't face me. Instead, he huffed like he had been mistreated, grabbed his jacket, and marched toward the exit as if he was the one who had been wronged. He threw the door open so hard it rattled against the wall. Before leaving, he shot me a glare, the kind that tried to shift the blame onto anyone but himself. Then he stomped outside without waiting for anyone to speak. The door slammed shut behind him, shaking the frame. The room stayed painfully still. I stood there holding my daughter, feeling a heat rise in my chest that made my hands tremble. It wasn't just anger. It was embarrassment mixed with something deeper, an old feeling I had ignored for too long. Every part of me felt tight, almost buzzing, like my body was trying to keep from exploding the same way he had. Mary slowly lifted her head from my shoulder. Her eyes were red, her cheeks wet. She looked so small, so unsure. Her voice came out soft, barely a whisper, as she asked a question that cut me more than his shouting ever could. "Mom, did I do something bad?" That simple sentence stopped my breath. I crouched down to her level, brushing her hair back gently, trying to steady my voice. I told her no, she had done nothing wrong, but inside me, something shifted, cold, sharp, and steady. It wasn't just about him anymore. It was about every moment I had allowed someone else's behavior to overshadow my child's peace. Right then, I knew something had to change, and I would be the one to make it happen. After the guests quietly drifted out and the house settled, I sat alone in the dim living room while Mary slept in her room. My mind wouldn't rest. It kept circling back, pulling up things I had pushed aside for years. Moments I brushed off. Behavior I excused. Times I told myself he was just stressed or misunderstood. One memory after another rose up like they had been waiting for me. Times when Cade messed up and I hurried to fix the damage for him. Occasions when he borrowed money and promised to return it, but somehow I never saw it again. Days when he snapped at strangers, and I forced a smile, smoothing things over because I was tired of apologizing for him. I remembered the nights he called asking for help, and I rushed out even when it was late, even when I was exhausted from caring for a child on my own. I thought I was being loyal. I thought I was keeping peace. In reality, I had spent years cushioning him from the consequences of his own actions. And the more I thought about it, the clearer it became. His behavior had a pattern. He was pleasant around people who stood firm, people he couldn't sway. But anyone smaller, quieter, or gentler became an easy place for him to dump his frustration. I had seen him do it to others. I never imagined he would turn that same cruelty toward my daughter. That realization hit me hard. I had opened the door to him again and again, hoping he would soften, hoping something in him would shift. Instead, I had offered him access to the person who mattered to me most. Sitting there in that quiet room, I felt something settle in my chest, a steady, solid resolve. Whatever happened going forward, I would not let him direct that kind of harm toward my child ever again. I realized that reacting with anger would only feed him. He thrived on conflict, on people losing control while he stayed calm. I needed a different approach, quiet, steady, and precise. My plan wouldn't be about loud confrontations or dramatic arguments. It would be about showing the truth, piece by piece, in a way he couldn't deny or twist. I started by looking through years of past interactions. Every favor he had asked, every promise he had made and broken, every time I had covered for him in front of our family, I recorded it all. Emails, texts, and small notes I had saved became pieces of a bigger picture. I created a clear trail, something tangible that even my relatives couldn't ignore. Next, I began documenting financial help. Money I lent him, things I paid to bail him out of tricky situations, little loans he never returned. Each entry was noted carefully with dates and amounts. I wasn't doing this to humiliate him publicly. I wanted proof, a quiet foundation I could use to finally hold him accountable. As I worked, I felt a growing sense of control. For the first time, I wasn't reacting to his behavior. I was taking steps that would shift the balance. He had relied on people giving in to his whims, believing no one would challenge him. But now, I was building something solid, something he couldn't scare away with a shout or a glare. By the time I finished, I had a full record of his actions laid out in front of me. The anger that had burned so hot in me after that birthday incident transformed into a calm determination. I knew exactly what I would do next, and for the first time in years, I felt completely ready to confront the truth, without losing myself in the process. After weeks of organizing, I finally had everything ready. All the instances where Cade had taken advantage of my trust were clearly recorded. Bills, notes, and confirmations he had sent me over the years formed a solid trail. Every time he promised to pay back or make amends, I had evidence of the empty words he left behind. I contacted a lawyer I trusted, someone I had worked with before, and laid out the situation calmly. I explained the loans, the favors, and the patterns I had documented. After reviewing everything, the lawyer confirmed what I suspected: I had undeniable proof. I could formally request repayment and hold him responsible in a way that couldn't be ignored or brushed aside. I thought about the confrontation ahead. Kate had always believed he could rely on charm, intimidation, or fear to get what he wanted. Now, the tools he depended on would be useless. The documents in my hands represented the truth, something he could not shout over or manipulate. Even as I prepared to take the next step, I reminded myself of my goal. This wasn't about punishing him or getting rich. I wanted him to understand that actions have consequences, that the excuses and threats would no longer protect him. My focus was accountability, ensuring he could not harm my daughter or me without facing the truth. Holding the stack of papers, I felt a weight lift off my shoulders. The anxiety and fear I had carried for years, watching him take advantage and intimidate, began to fade. For the first time, I felt the situation entirely within my control. Kate had relied on secrecy and family protection, but now everything was exposed, clear, and ready to confront him in a way that could no longer be denied. 7 days later, I prepared a dinner at my home and made sure everyone important would attend, including Cade. I kept the table simple but neat, with enough warmth to show the family that this gathering was serious, not casual. I had spent the past week rehearsing what I would say and gathering my courage. Tonight was not about anger, it was about clarity. When Cade arrived, his usual self-confidence filled the room. He smirked at familiar faces, leaned back in his chair, and carried the air of someone untouchable. He had no idea what I had prepared, and I let him settle in, letting that false sense of control linger just long enough. Once everyone was seated, I calmly pulled out the folder of papers I had spent weeks compiling. I spoke clearly, listing the loans, broken promises, and instances where he had relied on my goodwill while pretending responsibility to others. I explained that I was demanding repayment and, more importantly, that I would not allow him back into our lives until he addressed his anger and learned to respect the people around him. As I talked, I noticed the change in his face. The smirk faltered, his posture stiffened, and he no longer had the same swagger he had walked in with. He tried to interrupt, to argue, to twist the story, but my documentation left no room for debate. The weight of truth filled the room, and for the first time, the family could see past the mask he had worn for years. Their expressions shifted from hesitation to recognition. They were seeing him for who he had always been, not the version he presented. I felt a quiet sense of justice, knowing the years of excuses and false protection were ending tonight. For once, honesty and accountability were in control. After that evening, everything shifted. The family's perspective changed, and the walls he had hidden behind began to crumble. The quiet enabling that had allowed him to act without consequences finally ended. They no longer rushed to smooth over his mistakes or cover for his reckless choices. My parents, who had long given him silent support, finally set firm boundaries. They stopped lending him money, stopped offering assistance in ways he had always counted on. My sister, who used to quietly help him whenever he asked, refused to sign anything or intervene in his affairs. The foundation he relied on began to disappear piece by piece. Cade tried to fight back. He raised his voice, pointing fingers, attempting to twist the story and place the blame on me. He shouted, accusing me of turning the family against him, hoping the old dynamics would return. But this time, no one flinched. No one backed down. His familiar tactics had lost their effect. The room that once held his power now felt solid against him. Each member of the family, finally aware of the truth, stood firm in their own positions. When he demanded attention or tried to intimidate, they simply told him to step aside, to leave, to take the time to reflect and change. For the first time, the consequences of his actions were unavoidable. I watched him struggle to regain control, his usual confidence shaken. The mask he had worn for so long, the one that had convinced everyone he was capable and harmless, fell away entirely. He was left facing the reality he had always ignored, that respect could not be demanded through fear, and loyalty could not be assumed without trust. In that moment, his image, carefully built over years, collapsed completely. In the weeks that followed, the atmosphere at home began to change in subtle but meaningful ways. Mary started to laugh more freely, her small voice filling rooms without hesitation. She returned to her drawing, filling the pages with bright colors and scenes of joy rather than the anxious scribbles that had marked the days after her birthday. Each picture was a small sign that the tension that had hung over her had finally eased. Bedtime routines became peaceful again. She no longer tossed and turned, and the fear that had once kept her awake faded. Watching her drift off to sleep with a calm expression, I felt a warmth spread through me, a relief that my child could finally rest without worry. Her comfort became my comfort. Our conversations shifted too. She began sharing little stories about her day, thoughts she had been too scared to voice before. We laughed together, teased one another gently, and slowly rebuilt the safe little world she deserved. The home, once heavy with unspoken tension, felt lighter, as if Kate's presence had been a constant weight that we had finally lifted. As I observed her recovery, I reflected on my own transformation. The anger, frustration, and fear I had carried for years, protecting someone who would never take responsibility, started to dissipate. For the first time, I felt that I could focus on being the parent she needed, rather than a buffer for a grown man's temper. It was a quiet healing, but it was profound. The lessons were clear: peace could only return when boundaries were firmly set, and no one, not even family, had the right to overshadow the well-being of a child. In that calm, I found freedom and a renewed sense of strength. A few weeks later, the phone rang. I recognized Kate's number immediately. When I answered, his voice was low, cautious, and hesitant, nothing like the arrogance he usually carried. He tried to sound casual, even friendly, but I could hear the tension behind each word. He asked if things could return to how they used to be, if we could pretend the past months hadn't happened. I listened carefully, letting his words hang in the air for a moment. Then I spoke, my tone calm but firm. I explained that the dynamic he had relied on for years, where his outbursts went unchecked and no one challenged him, was over. The days when fear could control our family, especially my daughter, were finished. I made it clear that regaining trust required effort, respect, and accountability. He tried to interrupt, offering excuses, half apologies, and attempts to shift responsibility, but I held the line. I did not raise my voice, I did not threaten, and I did not plead. Instead, I let the truth stand on its own, letting him feel the weight of the consequences he had ignored for so long. By the end of the conversation, the silence on the line spoke louder than any argument could. For the first time, he experienced the power loss he had always avoided, realizing that his control over our lives had vanished, and that re-entering our world would take more than words. Hanging up, I felt a quiet satisfaction. My goal was never vengeance in the traditional sense, but a reclamation of peace and authority for my child and myself. That calm, firm boundary, and the inability to manipulate or intimidate, became the turning point. It was a lesson he would carry with him always, a lesson that no anger, no charm, and no excuses could undo.